on this episode of Indiana Education Insight.
We are continuing some of the initiatives that have been brought by chairmen in the past. That includes a free annual conference that we continue to hold. And this year we teamed up with DOE and held at the same time as the school finance seminar, which I think was helpful to schools coming in from outside of Indianapolis.
Right. Every week, the Indiana Association of Public School Superintendents is taking you inside today's Indiana education collaboration and tomorrow's education trends. We're staying on the pulse of public school innovators throughout Indiana and beyond. Join our conversation and contribute to our upcoming topics at iapssin.org/podcast. Here's your host, Dr. J.T. Koopman.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Indiana Education Insight. I'm Dr. J.T. Koopman, Executive Director of the IEPSS. Our weekly show features Indiana education innovators from all over our great state, discussing topics in the public education space and bringing in a variety of Indiana education innovators to hear their perspective. This show is brought to you by our IEPSS team and produced by our friends at Site Strategics and Edge Media Studios. We're always excited to hear from experienced and passionate educators, so let's get started with today's conversation.
Topics and trends in Indiana education.
Today's guest is Mrs. Sarah Cudahy, Executive Director for the Indiana Education Employee Relations Board, or as we know it, IEERB. Sarah has been instrumental in shaping the conversation about Indiana public schools, so she has the ability to look at education from various lenses, which is very important in the course of this conversation about public schools. Mrs. Cudahy has been a tremendous asset to public education in Indiana, so let's find out how she views the issues in Indiana public schools. Welcome, Mrs. Cudahy. We're thrilled to have you on today's show, and so let's get started with telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the IEERB organization.
Sure. So IEERB is the Indiana Education Employment Relations Board, as you said, otherwise known as IEERB. And we are a small agency. We have 5 staff, 5 board members, and we oversee all of the teacher labor relations for the state of Indiana. So in doing that, we have 5 different functions. We will oversee representation cases, and that answers the question, who represents whom?
Now, let's talk a little bit about that, if I'm going to interrupt you here for just a minute, please. Representation meaning, define
so
that.
The exclusive representative that will represent the teachers for collective bargaining and discussion.
Okay.
So we want to know, who is it? What's the name of the organization? And also, who is it they represent? Usually we say teachers, but it's not always teachers. Just teachers that are in the bargaining unit. So we'll answer those questions. One of the things we've seen recently is an uptick and a change in the bargaining unit. Mm-hmm. So who is it that's being represented by the union? And those all go through IEERB for a special process that we have in that. So that's one of the processes we have. The second one is unfair labor practice cases. So that answers the question, are the parties bargaining in good faith? Are they discussing in good faith? So it's really about process.
Sure.
So we'll determine those cases. We will also oversee impasse procedures, which are going on right now. So if the parties can't have a ratified collective bargaining agreement in 60 days, which is a very short time frame for bargaining, then we will go through impasse mediation, fact-finding, and those are all set out in the statute. We will provide those services and end up resolving the impasse for the parties if they can't do that themselves. Mm-hmm. Then once they agree on the contract, we'll come back and look at the compliance of those agreements. Have they decided things that the law allows them to decide? And finally, one of the big things we've been pushing recently is the research and training aspect of our agency, where we go out and talk to parties about how to have compliance, about what it is that IEERB does, and try and work together to make sure that everyone's following the law.
Well, to that last point, I personally have experienced how hard you work on what I refer to as your outreach and communicating with the superintendents and our members. You do a tremendous job with that, and I want to thank you for providing our members that opportunity. You had mentioned a couple of things about the bargaining process, and I think you defined it very well. Are there timelines associated with that?
Yes, and the timelines are new, JT, of course. So a law in 2017 that was passed moved our bargaining from September to the middle of from August 1 to September 15th, 45 days back. And so impasse was declared November 17th for everyone that couldn't have a collective bargaining agreement. And we are right now in the process of finding mediators for all of the parties that haven't agreed. I have to say this year, 2017, is I think going to be a record for the fewest number of parties at impasse. We only have about 6 that have not reached a tentative agreement at this time. So that's great. Parties are out there agreeing on their own terms for their collective bargaining agreement. And I think a lot of that has to do with people getting out there and talking, whether it's through the IEPSS district meetings or in other places where they're learning about compliance and they're working together and they're working hard, the parties together at the table to have a good relationship, and that's great.
Yeah, that's great. Well, obviously you have, and you just spoke to that, you have a great interest in helping schools in a variety of ways. Do you have a primary focus that you look to with your agency?
Our mission is to promote harmonious relations between public school teachers and the schools they serve. So our primary mission is to go out and help schools and teachers know what the limits are of collective bargaining, know what the obligations are of school employers and collective bargaining. And then also the newest piece of that, I think, is to let people know what compliance means. So we got the compliance mission in 2015, and we've been trying to reach out to parties and let them know. So those are really the two primary things that we work on, and a lot of, again, through research and training, making sure that parties understand all of that.
There's been a lot of change in a short amount of time as it relates to collective bargaining in schools. Are there any new initiatives that have been set up to help Indiana schools or your agency that you're working on right now?
Sure, great question. Yes, there has been a lot of change. Every year I've been here, there have been changes to collective bargaining, and some big ones this year.
Right.
Not only the bargaining timeline that you mentioned, but also now we keep track of union membership, and we are currently sending out letters to all teachers in bargaining units in which fewer than a majority are members of the union. So that's currently going on. So those are some big changes. We are continuing some of the initiatives that have been brought by chairmen in the past. That includes a free annual conference that we continue to hold. And this year we teamed up with DOE and held at the same time as the school finance seminar, which I think was helpful to schools coming in from outside of Indianapolis. Right. We also have been doing more training, outreach, more written guidance. We've really tried to emphasize, if parties are bringing me questions over and over, we have a guide for that to try and give them some input into that process. We also have been trying to work with some other state agencies to make sure that we aren't having multiple messages being sent from the agencies. So we've worked hard at that, and pre-impasse mediation. We're continuing that. Some of the new initiatives that have been started recently, one is a stakeholder meeting. So I've been meeting with anyone that wants to meet, but generally it's the attorneys, some of the organizations like the School Boards Association, like some of the statewide union affiliates. I bring them in and I tell them how I think the year is going. I tell them some of the things IERB is trying to do, and I get their input. And that input has been valuable so that we can turn around and say, okay, there are some changes we want to make to the teacher letter, or there are some other things that we want to do, some processes that worked, maybe some that haven't worked. So we've really taken that input in and used it to help, then turn around and help the parties.
Right.
One of the other things we did this year, which is new, we have pre-impasse mediation, but we actually sent a neutral financial consultant out to a school district to help the parties and just explain the school finance, and that actually was a big success. And so I'm looking for input from schools and teachers about whether or not that's something that they would like, and I'm going to try and bring that into next year's bargaining season.
Yeah.
So,
and especially in a situation now, fortunately the amount of distrust that we enjoyed previously is lessened considerably as a result of this. But there still exists, well, I don't believe your numbers, or I don't believe your numbers. So having that independent individual come in and verify it one way or the other,
right,
it doesn't make any difference, just verify it one way or the other, I think would go a long way to establishing any trust that may have been misapplied in certain situations. Now, is IERB created by statute, or is this at the governor's will? How does that work?
IERB is created by statute. The 5 members, 3 are appointed by the governor, 1 is appointed by the leader of the House, 1 is appointed by the leader of the Senate, and then the board itself then will oversee the executive director.
Okay. Most of your direction, I think, comes through statute.
Yes.
Through our legislature. Are there any pieces of legislation in our legislature that you see coming up, or are there any things that you're governed by federally?
No, we are not. We don't really have anything governed by federally. Sometimes when you do compliance, if there are federal laws that we think maybe the parties have kind of gone awry with, we'll note that in the compliance report. One of the big things that had come up with that really we don't see a lot of issues with was the Federal Medical and Leave Act, otherwise known as FMLA. We've had a lot of questions about that when we first did compliance, but otherwise we don't deal too much with those issues. For the General Assembly session this year, I'm not aware of anything that's specifically collective bargaining, but as we all know, there are lots of laws that can touch peripherally on collective bargaining. And one of those, I believe, will be a cleanup bill to HB 1009, the law that is changing the school funds. And that is going to come into effect January 1 of 2019. So that's going to be huge. It changes the definition of deficit financing.
Yeah, sure does.
And so we are working with other state agencies and, of course, IEERB to make sure that we're going to try and make it as clean as possible for the parties and as easy as possible. But that's something that we're still working through. So depending on what that cleanup bill looks like, we're going to be looking at that as well. And really most of it is just continuing to implement the changes that we've still seen from last year. So we're still in the middle of the new timeline. Still in the middle of the new teacher letters. So that's what I see now. I think the General Assembly is going to continue to look at this issue of deficit financing and schools that may be in front of the Distress Unit Appeals Board, otherwise known as DUAB. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's some legislation like that. Whether or not it touches collective bargaining, we'll have to see.
Well, one of the big changes that we saw in collective bargaining is you can't have a contract longer than 2 years. And that's typically a biennial contract over the term of when the state establishes
end past the state
budget.
Right.
And you can't enter into deficit financing.
Right.
So now let me ask you this question. We just late last week, we had the state say that our appropriations are not going to meet the needs of the school district due to an error in calculating the expected enrollment. Is that going to affect anything you do with the contract?
Well, it's a great question, JT, and it's something I don't think we have seen in the last couple of years.
Sure haven't.
So one of the things the IEERB board did a couple of years ago when we figured out that the DOE certification, which is what we base our deficit financing on and fact-finding, was being based on the estimate and not the certification because of the timeline. So we knew that there could be a little bit of a deviation in what was actually being given. So what the board allowed the parties to do, which was to give an estimate of that certification in order to say, hey, we don't actually think, or board, that we will be receiving this much. We may be receiving more. We may be receiving less. So in this case, we don't have an IEERB board order, of course, on that issue, but I could see parties, if they think that the certification or the amount is going to be different, arguing at fact-finding, if we have any parties that go to fact-finding what that is, and then the appointed fact finder will have to make a determination as to what that revenue is. And that's really what you're speaking to, the revenue part of the revenues. We don't want expenditures exceeding revenues. And so, of course, if your revenue is a little bit different, that can, make a big impact on that calculation, depending on what it ends up being.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's going to be significant, but nonetheless, it's just a interesting little twist in your world.
Yes, you're right.
Not that it's not complicated enough as it is, but now you have to add in this little twist as well.
Right. And you bring up a great point, which is that deficit financing can be defined so many different ways. And one of the things that I have been trying to make parties aware of is that we have a specific statutory definition of deficit financing, which may be different than what other people look at. And so one of the things that I want to do as a new initiative in the next IERB conference is have a big chunk of that be devoted to how do I know if we're in deficit financing and going through what 1009 means, bringing in last best offer requirements, and letting parties really walk through that. That's something we haven't seen parties be interested in until now. But I think it's really important to know at the table, even if you're not going to fact finding, what would happen if I went to fact finding? Am I in deficit financing? So that's something we're really going to focus in on and bring in. We've already had some financial consultants come in and do some in-house staff training on making sure that we're up to date on all of that. So.
That kind of brings me back to another court case, actually, and that was making a determination for work outside of getting paid for work outside of the normal workday. Does that have anything to do with any of your work in how that's defined and how people get paid, or is that not something that you have to worry about?
Well, I think you're referring to probably both Nettle Creek, which was in front of the Court of Appeals, and Jay, which ultimately went up to the Indiana Supreme Court. And those two court cases combined really look at exactly what you're talking about. I call them buckets, which is, we have regular teaching duties for which we get our teacher salary that's on our individual teacher contract, and we may be paid wages for ECA or CCA, the extracurricular, co-curricular activities. And then we have this in between. We call them ancillary duties.
Right.
So for things outside of our normal work duties, the parties can bargain ancillary duties. That comes to us in a couple of different ways. One is what the IERB board has said is the school employer determines ancillary duties, what they are. The parties just bargain the wages. Not everyone agrees with that. So we haven't had kind of another court case to determine what the bounds of that are and who decides what those are. The second thing that it comes to is compliance and fact-finding.
Sure.
So are the parties bargaining what those duties are, or are they bargaining the wages? And so there are parties that have gotten in that gray area where we've put a general comment about kind of strayed from just bargaining the wages to bargaining the actual duties. We think that's the school employer's prerogative to determine that. And so we continue to have some of those every year where the board every year will go through and we'll clarify on the rubric what that difference is between those things.
Sure. Does ACA and any possible changes in the Affordable Care Act have anything to do with your agency and what you see in contracts?
I think what we see in contracts maybe 1260, which was the law that looked at, now that was a state law, of course, that said you can't, as a school, pay more for your school contributions than the state pays for my contributions, for example, for state employee contributions, did change the way that we saw health insurance in contracts, just what the parties bargained or agreed to, and we did see some schools go on the state plan. And then we also saw the deficit financing piece, as you said, from the 2011 changes also change how school employees and school employers were bargaining the health insurance. Similarly, I think not directly, but tangentially, we will see that depending on what happens with the ACA.
Right.
So what the requirements are for employers, if that changes, we may see what the parties decide. And of course, for our fact finders, determining which plan is better. Of course, we want to be compliant with all the laws, including the ACA. So sometimes that will come into fruition. So we stay up on the state and federal laws just so that we make sure that we're not running afoul of it in our determinations, but also when we're doing compliance, that we can let the parties know if we find anything. We don't make an ultimate determination on that as far as in the compliance reports, but we do like to point it out if we see it.
Sounds like there's always a moving target.
Yes, I think that's right.
And the complexity of these issues that you have to deal with is absolutely amazing. And I will say that IERB does a terrific job under your leadership in dealing with those and keeping track of them, and also trying to look into the future and plan for them. So I want to tell you how much we appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you.
In that regard. Any advice that you would have for our Indiana school leaders and possibly teachers associations as we move forward?
Absolutely. I think the first one is everyone knows. For labor relations, it's the relations part that matters.
Yep.
So keeping up your relations as best you can is crucial. We can provide guidance. Of course, we don't know your school as well as, you know your school better than I do.
Right.
But I can always give general pointers and things that I hear along the way.
Yep.
Whenever a superintendent or a union president calls me, I try and pick their brain,
Sure.
to be able to pass those things on.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest thing, though, is we are here to help the parties. I mean, I would love it if we didn't have any impasses. If there are impasse cases, we're happy to work with the parties, try and resolve that. We can make a determination if not. But I really want it to stay locally based if possible.
Yep.
And so part of that is knowing what the law is and how to comply with it.
Sure.
And sometimes it's about saying, we have a problem and we don't know how to write the answer. We don't know how to make sure that the health insurance isn't going to be too much for the school, but that it's not too much for the teachers.
Yep.
We've read tens of thousands of contracts. We can help you out. We can tell you what the law
Right.
says. We
Yep.
can tell you what the IEERB board decisions are. And so I really encourage people to pick up the phone and call. I've had that, and we've had an increase in the calls from teachers, which is great. So we're going to continue to go out there. Anyone that asks us, I've been just at single bargaining tables this year, trying to help, particularly with schools that are still rolling off old contracts. So use us. I mean, that's what we're there for. I love talking to people and going out and meeting with people and seeing what we can do to help.
Yep. You had mentioned the compliance guides, and I know that you've put a significant amount of information to guide the work of the school districts on your website with compliance guides, and I think that's been extremely beneficial, so thank you for that. I've also heard you say, here's my cell number.
Yes.
Call me, even if it's in the middle of a bargaining session. I would rather you get it right than get it wrong, and then we have another conversation at another time. So that's your commitment to this process, and so I'm not sure that everybody would make that kind of commitment. So thank you for doing that as well. Anything you want to add in closing?
I'd really like to thank the parties, teachers and schools. Everyone has been, I know everyone has a lot going on, and particularly this new timeline falls right in between the holidays. So I'd like to thank everyone for their willingness to listen to us, to try and follow the guidance, to reach out if they need help. This is something that we're all in together, so I really appreciate the parties doing what they can to help, and we'll help in return.
Okay, well, good. Well, thank you, Mrs. Cudahy, for being our guest on the IPSS edition of Indiana Education Insight. Now it's time to wrap up this episode with my take on the current state of affairs in the Indiana education landscape.
Dr. JT's closing comments.
Unfortunately, even though we have so much research about the fact that Indiana and all states are facing a teacher shortage, just like we need a commitment to high-quality public schools and education, we need to make an investment in high-quality teacher preparation programs for our public schools. Moreover, we need to find an appropriate way to compensate our educators. Without a clearly defined career path and adequate compensation, we're not going to attract new teachers, and we're not going to keep the ones in the profession. It's my hope that we can get our legislators and state leaders to see the value of public schools and the nexus of promoting public schools and economic development in our Hoosier communities. I see these as investments in our children and in our state, not as an expenditure. Perhaps we can pursue this issue and others in another segment of Indiana Education Insight. On our next show, December 11th, we welcome Dr. Karen Dowling, Director of Admissions for Education Leaders at Olivet University. Perhaps she can provide some additional insight into the State House and education. Join us for that and more on the next Insight into Indiana Education. Thanks for being part of Indiana Education, and please stand up for Indiana Public Schools.